The National Health Service turned 70 on the 5th of July 2018. When it was launched by the Minister of Health Aneurin Bevan on the 5th of July 1948, it was based on three core principles: that it was free at the point of delivery, that it meets the needs of everyone, and that it was based on clinical need, not the ability to pay.
City, University of London is proud to support the NHS at 70. It is a service that belongs to the people, and its common principles bind together its staff and the people they serve. Working at the limits of science, the NHS exists to improve our health and well-being.
In City, we have a long history of providing healthcare education, working closely with the NHS to educate the nurses, midwives, radiographers, speech and language therapists and optometrists of tomorrow. Our researchers are producing world-leading work to support and educate healthcare provision, and we work closely with service users and carers to ensure that our education and our research works for them. In this video, we celebrate our relationship with the NHS, talking to some of the staff and students about their experiences and celebrating with them everything that the NHS means to us. Happy birthday.
At the core of the NHS are, of course, the people who work there. So we start off by going to talk to one of the NHS's most distinguished nurses.
So Harry, thank you very much for coming today to talk to me.
No problem.
Harry McCree was born in Mile End in East London in 1926, and he worked in the NHS for 34 years. In 1979, he received an OBE for his contribution to the NHS.
You had a very long career in the NHS, but also you were born before the NHS actually started.
Don't need any reminding, I guess.
You keep telling me. Have you got memories of healthcare before the
Yes, I
NHS?
have, yes.
Could you tell us about any
Well,
of those?
I'm sure lots have been written, but we had the usual kind of general practitioner service. I remember Dr. Morphy's cure was seen to be the same bottle of medicine for whatever you went for, you know.
Yeah. So, do you remember how you decided that you wanted to do nursing?
Well, it really goes back to that socially necessary bit. It's sort of on the edge of the kind of Marxist ideas. That's really how I sort of went into the nursing. But I didn't go into general, I went into the local hospital, and they call it hospital, for the mentally handicapped. And then from there, I was seconded to general nursing, which I did in Lancaster.
Right.
So while I was still working theoretically for the Royal Albert, which was handicapped,
Yeah.
I was actually sort of doing my training.
For general nursing
general
at the
nursing,
Royal
yeah.
Lancaster.
Which I enjoyed enormously.
Yeah. Could you say a bit about how you got involved with the J Report?
That's rather funny, really, because I went to the General Nursing Council. There used to be an annual voting, and I became third for some reason. I thought, nobody else knows me. And then the guy that got it was promoted. He went to the Department of Health, and a little later they promoted that. They upped the second guy on the. He did something else. He became something else. So they actually sort of fell on the third one. So it became me, and I was invited and joined the General Nursing Council.
This is the plaque from the General Nursing Council, which commemorates the years that it was in existence before the UKCC. Yeah.
Well, that plaque, of course, is not an official.
No.
It's one that I engineered, sort of thing, because Muriel was quite like into pottery, and
She was, yes.
She had a pottery friend, so I did those really
Beautiful.
for my colleagues.
No, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that.
Yeah.
So you were on the GNC before the J Report, so that was in the
Well, I became a member of the J.
A member, sorry, of the.
And that's when I met Peggy J, and I became the deputy chairman of the J Committee.
And that was a groundbreaking.
Well, it was groundbreaking, and the department didn't really quite know what they were doing at the time, I don't think, because we far exceeded the expectations of the department. Really, I think because they didn't tighten up the terms of reference enough. And there were one or two quite bright lads and thought they'd take advantage of that and proceed beyond the expectations of what the committee should be looking at and doing. And that was quite sensible, really. So there were one or two lads on it that were quite useful. There was one chap with some psychology, about the only psychologist I ever remember being useful.
I think we laugh. We're surrounded by psychologists in this
are we
building.
really? Oh God! Will I get out?
But that report really, for the experience of people with learning disability, and particularly, I suppose, for children born or with inherited learning disability, the difference to their lives as a result of that committee was absolutely profound, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it did have an impact.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sadly, of course, it was also produced kind of conflict between the Royal College, between the nursing and the social work.
Sure.
Social work really let us down, really. They were pretty feeble. They didn't the social services never embraced the Jay report in a way. They all backed off, said, oh, we can't do that, we can't, it's too difficult, But no one actually sort of really grasped the nettle and say, boy, the report does set out some pretty clear reasons why nurse training is not necessarily the best option. But it all just became a fuzz.
Which brings me to something which you and I have spoken about a few times, the experience of watching the wheel turning of reorganisation and perhaps coming back to where you were 20 years ago, which in your very long career you must have seen a few times. I mean, what do you think when you look at that now as somebody who no longer works within the health service but has a lot of knowledge about the health service?
Well, I think the one observation is that the reports in themselves don't bring the change.
No.
They do help individuals who are making waves to support their kind of agenda, but of itself it doesn't really do a great deal.
It doesn't make the change.
And the great thing is that change comes from within rather than from without, it seems to me. I mean, there were so many inquiries in.
Yes.
But the inquiries, of course, are still coming, aren't they?
Yeah. And do you, Harry, one thing which I think people will be interested in is that you were awarded the OBE for your services. What would you say was the most important, what's the thing that you see as the biggest achievement in your career? I mean, would it be that or would it be other things?
I wouldn't say, getting the OBE is not an achievement, no.
No,
I
thought you were going to say that.
Yeah, no. No, in fact, you shouldn't really have accepted it. If I'd ever been a genuine, honest-to-God sort of lefty, I would have said you would stuff your OBE.
You would, yeah.
I mean, that's
John Lennon style.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you really should have done. But the idea that that a working class boy gets an OBE, it would have been very disappointing, I think, to my wife and my parents and everybody else who knew me. If I said, "Well, is this Mylen Spiv sort of getting OBEs?" What do you think he's doing?
Well, I feel quite proud that you've got the OBE, so I'm glad that you did accept it. And I think for nurses as well, it's really important that nurses are recognised, and they very rarely are. So, and Harry, I'd just like to thank you for your time and actually for what you've given to nurses. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you for having me.
At City University, we always strive to highlight the role of women in the development of our health service. Even in the 19th century, pioneer nurses were laying the groundwork for the NHS by campaigning for the systemisation of the health service and for government recognition of the nursing profession. This important campaign went hand in hand with the suffragette movement, and on International Women's Day, City University staff, students and guests gathered to commemorate the inspirational work of these early pioneers.
I think it's absolutely crucial that our students not only understand the personal history in terms of the professions they've gone into, but also they develop a very strong sense of social justice, that they are confident and able to challenge the status quo and sometimes speak up for patients that are not able to speak up for themselves.
The event celebrated the lives of two nurses, Catherine Pine and Ethel Bedford Fenwick.
Ethel Bedford Fenwick campaigned for over 30 years for the establishment of a register for nurses. One of her great principles was that there should be no compromise in nursing education, with one portal entry into the profession and no two-tier system. Ethel had great energy and drive. She and her co-campaigners lobbied tirelessly, and eventually in 1919 the register was opened and Ethel Bedford Fenwick's name was entered as State Registered Nurse number 1. Thanks to the fantastic work of the Barts archivist, we've got the original copy of Ethel's application to join the register and some of her nursing badges. And we're hugely grateful for their help, for keeping these priceless articles safe and accessible so that future generations of nurses and midwives can see them.
Ethel was already a pioneer as an early professional woman, insisting as she did on a bigger canvas than that provided by the hearth and the home. We assume that even as a relatively well-heeled woman, she had to battle for some of the things that we take for granted: the right to be educated, the right to a civic life, and the right to earn money through her labour. As users of health and care services, we all owe a debt of gratitude to pioneers like Ethel, who put nursing on a professional footing and paved the way for the many advances in nursing practice that have occurred over the last century.
I'm now going to talk about Catherine Pine, who was born in 1864. Catherine trained also at St Bart's Hospital with good reports throughout her training. She was described as a nice, sensible woman. A bit like myself, I thought. In 1908, Catherine and another Barts nurse, Gertrude Townend, ran a nursing home where suffragettes were cared for as they recovered from hunger strikes and force feeding that they endured in Holloway Prison. It was this nursing home that Emmeline Pankhurst went after her release from prison, and as a consequence of the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913, the nursing home became a focus for police and press activity, and Catherine was therefore forced to care for patients, moving round various addresses in London.
What Catherine and her peers wanted was the opportunity for women to live rich, self-determined and full lives in the domestic sphere if they sought it in the public realm. A century ago, a significant step forward was made when the first women, not all women, secured the vote. Catherine played her part in that victory by providing care and encouragement to women on the front line of the suffragist battle. But I'm sure I'm not alone in wondering what Ethel and Catherine would make of where we are today. Events this year in industries including film, TV, politics, have reminded us how little room there is for complacency about women's rights. So perhaps we all need to channel a little bit of Ethel and Catherine and redouble our efforts, whether we're practicing nurses, educators, researchers, leaders or regulators, and commit ourselves to reducing inequalities and championing for all the quality of life we want for ourselves and for our loved ones. So thank you for inviting me to be part of your celebration, and a very happy International Women's Day.
It's exciting to see how many people still find the work of these nurses inspirational and relevant today.
In what way do you think Ethel can inspire young people in nursing today?
I think probably from a point of view of her perseverance, because women had no voice then. I'm just reading an interesting book by Mary Beard about women not having a voice for so long. She really persevered, and she went against an awful lot of her senior peers to make something happen when it was very much a man's world. And if we think it's a man's world now, well, it was totally, totally different then.
So why do you think she has been under-recognised in the past?
Well, I think the great nurses, the sort of iconic nurses, such as Florence Nightingale or Mary Seacole, have always been very closely associated with war. So both of those women were associated with the Crimean War. And what we don't know so much about is nurses who might be famous or important because of their contribution during peacetime. And we do know that a lot of nurses were active in the suffrage movement, but very little is known about any of them. And they're not really celebrated by nursing. So I think that women like Catherine, because they're accessible to people, because you could imagine being Catherine Pine, well I could anyway, much more than being Emmeline Pankhurst, that they do provide a really incredible role model, that you can achieve a lot, and that each individual contribution to something for example, women's suffrage, can make an enormous difference. To think that somebody who's ordinary could actually be quite extraordinary.
Since its conception, the NHS has been constantly evolving. As in the past, the people driving the change are the staff who work in it. We now go to talk to current and future healthcare practitioners about what the NHS means to them and where they see it going in the future.
What does the NHS mean to you?
The NHS means a lot to me. I think it embodies everything that's British, so all the British values of fairness and equality for all.
The NHS is something that I've come to take for granted in such a way that I almost don't think about it, in terms of it's something that if I need healthcare or my family or friends need healthcare, it's simply there.
And when you think about difficult times in your life, you know, when you've got ill family members or when family members are passing on, you don't even have to think about that care or where you go or who you talk to.
It's helped my mum, my aunt, my sister, my niece, my nephew, and it doesn't ask for much in return. So, you know, it gives to so many people and does not ask for much back.
I don't think I would be here if it wasn't for the NHS.
It's a bit of a foundation for all the healthcare that I've ever known.
Knowing that I can always get healthcare throughout my life and knowing that it's going to be of a very high standard.
It's a key defining part of our culture of Britain, coming out of the Second World War and the terrible things that had happened.
And the very fact that we picked it up in the Olympics, that you had nurses dancing around beds and things, that it's something that's highly, well, everyone knows about, and I think the majority value.
Knowing that when you are stuck, you've got somewhere to turn. So I think it's fundamental to our country especially.
I've seen its good points and I've seen its bad points, as many of us have. And I've been able to compare it with health systems around the world, and it's a superb system that we can all be extremely proud of.
When I've had the experience to go to a different country, that really has opened my eyes into our NHS, that people really are compassionate and care, the doctors, nurses, irrespective of your colour, your race, your orientation.
It kind of feels a bit like a kind of strange family, really. One where you kind of really appreciate and love that family, but also you complain a lot about it as well. So they annoy me, they irritate me, the service isn't always great, but I always expect it to be there. And if anybody criticise the NHS, I very much defend it. So I kind of think about it a bit like part of my family, I suppose. But I wouldn't want them round for Christmas dinner. So.
So what inspired you to work in the NHS?
I think for me it's all about giving back to the community, giving back to where we began, because I know like throughout my life I've been in and out of the NHS with myself and my family, so I think it was just something that I thought it's amazing. It's such a rewarding career to go down.
I was expecting to become a civil servant. That's what my parents wanted. And then I was doing voluntary work in a mental health hospital, helping occupational therapists. And I thought, this is fascinating, and it really made a difference on a daily basis to the people I was working with.
I care about people. I started off as an adult nurse, and really being able to look after people and, you know, see the smiles on their faces once they feel well looked after.
I've always had a very caring nature. Originally, the plan was to join the police force, but the careers advisor said, have you ever thought about nursing?
I myself was born in a maternity home in the 1960s, and I can remember my mother talking about the general practitioner and how important having that known and trusted person was when I was born, and how much difference that made to her.
I'd always wanted to be a nurse from very young. I had quite a lot of experience. My mother spent quite a lot of time in and out of hospital when we were children, so I sort of was used to seeing nurses lots of the time, so it was something I'd always wanted to do when I left school.
Well, I was very much influenced, of course, you know, by my mother. She was a really strong role model. I don't think nursing was the first choice that my mother wanted me to pursue, to be perfectly frank. But I was very much influenced by her, and I did apply for nurse training posts in the Republic of Ireland, but it was just literally impossible to get a place. So I was fortunate that I secured a place in London.
My sister was going through treatment, and my nephew was born prematurely, and you know, you would talk to the members of staff, the nurses, doctors, and their aura would just be so welcoming and so calm and so kind and warm.
As a child, my mother said to me when I was in the pram, I always used to get very excited by seeing new people. And I think I've carried that through. I like meeting new people. I like being with people. They come in all different shapes and sizes and different personalities, different backgrounds. It's a really interesting place to work. And I think anybody coming into nursing as a career now, it's a phenomenally interesting environment.
One instant that stands out was when I was a student and I was ill and in hospital, and I didn't have family around, and it was Diwali, which is an Indian festival, which by the way I don't really celebrate, but the nurses thought I did, and because I was in hospital on my own, they made sure that I got a really nice meal for the day. One of them brought me Indian sweets, and I've always remembered that, so that when I've been working in the NHS, I wanted to give that back.
Do you have any particular memory or experience from either receiving treatment from the NHS or working in the NHS that you'd like to share with us today?
My earliest memory is of mass sunray treatments, but we used to go along, strip down to our underpants, and put goggles on us, and we sat in circles in front of sunray lamps that were positioned around the room, and the smell of the ozone that was produced from the ultraviolet light was really very strong. And the other memory that sticks in my mind, we were given rosehip syrup, small spoonsful of rosehip syrup afterwards. And so even now, if I'm out on a sunny day, if I smell ozone on clothes or in the air, if I have rosehip syrup, I'm straight back to sitting in that room.
I was working on a ward, and with the ward managers we were looking at how we would even out the shifts for the delivery suite. So trying to work out how to get the optimum number of midwives for when women gave birth. And obviously that's a very difficult thing to think about. So one of the midwives said to me, I wonder what would happen if we ever talked to somebody who worked for Birdseye, because when they shell the peas have to be frozen, and they have to make sure there's enough people on the shift, because nobody ever knows when a pea is going to pop. So we actually arranged for a visit to the Birdseye pea shelling factory to find out how they rostered their workers, because it is true, at the moment, they only have 2 hours when the peas go burst before they can actually freeze the peas. So we learned a lot about shift rostering and brought that back in.
There was a patient who I got called to by my colleagues in speech therapy. They said she had a very unusual speech disorder. She had had a stroke and was on the neurology wards. This was before the time of CT scanning stroke patients. And I went to see her, and clearly she was very unusual speech disability, nothing like any stroke I'd seen before. And I persuaded her to try and talk to me, and she spoke very well and claimed to be making particular errors, and they really weren't apparent, and I reminded her of those. And then I said I'd see her the next morning because these things seemed to be clearing up very quickly. This was a lady in a wheelchair, and when she came back she said, "You're right, my speech has improved, I can talk perfectly well." And then I asked her to take my arm and get out the wheelchair, and she couldn't, she said, but she eventually reached out and walked across with me and burst into tears.
Probably one of the most key moments for me and for us as modern society has been that I was a clinical nurse working with people with HIV and AIDS at a time in the 80s, 90s, when there was a great deal of ignorance and prejudice and discrimination. And so as well as working with patients and trying to make them feel that people wanted to care for them, people wanted to touch them, people wanted to speak to them, and people wanted to treat them normally, which was what I was trying to do, it was trying to set up services for them so that they felt that they could access the healthcare service.
One of the things that I will always remember is the uniform I had to wear, which was marvellous because it had puff sleeves and it had a little hat and it had a starched white apron. And, you know, when I think back, I really felt like a nurse in it.
I fell off my bike because I wasn't wearing a helmet and fractured my skull and ended up in Addenbrooke's, and yes, and well, they put me back together again, I suppose. And
I do a lot of cycling, and I got hit off my bike. Well, someone opened their car door into me. Obviously, that was such a horrible experience. Just like the level of care I got and everyone I'd met throughout the whole process, like ambulance people and the nurses and stuff, was just so good.
When I was in secondary school, that kind of age, is my mother started work as a post-mortem technician, and she worked not far from where my school was, so I would regularly walk across to get a lift home at the end of the school day and wait in the office and chat with people from the NHS, but also the police, coroner's officers, undertakers. So again, it felt kind of very friendly and warm and connected. And then one day I remember, you know, walking across to get my lift home, and then shortly after I had got there, a person who was working on the hospital site, who was doing some decorating outside, was mugged and attacked and hit quite severely on the back of the head. And I remember my mother went out to give first aid and then shouted for me to call the ambulance. So I remember as a kind of young teenager ringing to get an ambulance sent to a mortuary, and then yes, on the phone trying to explain myself that actually this was needed for a real person who was outside rather than someone in the mortuary. So yes, that was a strange one as a teenager.
Last year I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I had my operation last November in my local hospital in Maidstone. And the care that I received right from the beginning was incredible. So I was diagnosed very quickly. I was fast-tracked for genetic testing. I was operated on and then had radiotherapy and finally discharged, but continued to receive medication with free prescriptions for 10 years, which is incredible.
Most of the memories are about the patients I've nursed, actually, and the people you get to know really well. So some of them were elderly patients, people on my first ward, myself and a student nurse spent months badgering a poor person who'd had a stroke who people said would never walk again. And I think as students you're sometimes a bit altruistic, and you think, oh yes. And it was really nice to see him go home walking on a Zimmer frame.
I had a great opportunity in one of my first placements to go and visit families alongside community nurses, and I was absolutely inspired by not only the quality of their commitment but their compassion to work alongside families, many of whom were living in poverty, to make sure that they access services and were able to create opportunities not only for their health but wider life chances for their families.
I think it was when my nan was in hospital, so she was nearing the end of her life, and it was an actual nurse from the same background, and it was her understand the way I could leave the hospital at the end of every day knowing that she was there to care for her.
But how relevant do you think the founding principles are today?
The NHS is absolutely critically important to my worldview because I believe in having a healthcare system that's free at the point of delivery and is universal, and the NHS is exactly that.
I think the idea of having a system that actually is free for people when they need it and is supported by everybody, I mean, is pretty unique in the world, and as such I think it's probably the thing I'm most proud of in terms of being a British citizen.
I think they are still really relevant. I think, you know, in the society we live today, for it to be fair and equal, I think that's one of the things that makes the NHS stand out. It doesn't really matter, you know, whether you're rich or poor or, you know, where you're from. You get free treatment, you get treatment that's the same for everyone. And I think those values still hold true today.
In a way, we need to treasure them and guard them. There is a risk that people will lose touch with understanding just how important that is. So I'm very, very familiar with the evidence, having done a lot of research on health policy and systems. This kind of system is incredibly efficient.
I think it's great that people don't have to worry about affording medical treatment, that it's free at the point of access, and that it's dependent on funding from taxation, and that's paid according to income. So that seems to me a very fair and equitable system.
My view is, in principle, it has to be free at the point of delivery. It's what we should be doing in this society. It's one of the key principles within, I think, a UK context, and one of the things that I value within our society. But also through doing that and being open to everybody, you're bringing together groups that would not normally be together and shaping, I think, more the kind of local population through the kind of delivery of healthcare and social care.
Well, I think the fundamental thing it means is that it's something that you pay for out of taxation, irrespective of whether you need it at the time, so that it's there when you do need it. And you do accept that some people are going to need it more than others, that it's actually according to people's need.
The NHS is very much, for me, the central tenet of all these values and behaviours and principles that we try to teach our students. So things such as compassion, communication, caring, being competent. It's about, respecting the patient. It's about providing as much care as we can to our patients. I think they're really, really important for us to be able to deliver those principles to our students.
If we change any of those principles, or if any of those principles come under question, what you're actually doing then is taking away the very foundation of what healthcare is all about.
And what do you think the future of the NHS is?
Well, I think it was Aneurin Bevan that said that the NHS will exist as long as there are people around who will fight for it. It's 70 years now since he said that, and since he introduced the Act of Parliament which founded it. So I think the future probably depends on who's fighting for it.
I think the NHS is riding the storm and is being very creative in finding solutions to work with an ever-changing population, funding, scientific research, new advances, all feeding into the body of the NHS.
While you have the NHS, it means that everybody working in the NHS gets that tremendously good clinical experience. Whereas if you started splitting up provisions into different institutions, or then you'd find that the expertise of practitioners would diminish, and so it's of benefit to everybody that we still have that NHS system.
I mean, I really really fervently hope that we keep it forever. I know that there is concern amongst some people that with ageing populations and different health requirements that the NHS is under strain, but I see the solution to that as providing more funding and more independence for the people who are the experts within the system.
If I had one request though, it would be to depoliticise the NHS, because that's the way to help it not just survive but thrive for another 70 years.
I do worry about the political playing around with the NHS at the moment.
There is a cynical way that in the political sphere, the fact that people tend not to understand numbers, and if you throw a lot of numbers at them, people they may think you're talking sense. There's nothing new about fake news.
I'm hoping that with the changes in the government, but also with the changes of times, that we will maintain it, we will try and improve it, we will try to improve the workforce, we're trying to ensure that it's always number one, this organisation.
There's so much that's great about the NHS and so much that's good about it that I can't really imagine this country without the NHS, so I do think the future is bright.
This initiative is a wonderful way to recall what an important part the NHS has played in the life of all of us. It's transformed the health of a nation and it's become the envy of the world.